because this is clear acoustics, and before we had such bad, I don't know, was anybody here for the earlier event? No, I mean, it makes sense. You wouldn't come back after that event. Okay, my name's Allegra Stratton. I'm contributing editor at Bloomberg, and we have quite a panel for you here. It's pretty impressive. As a former TV producer, this is the kind of panel I would have dreamed to assemble. It's about the SME report that Natwest have assembled. They did it before COP26. They've updated it after this tumultuous year. We're going to have James Close and Peter Mannion talk you through it in a second. But first of all, we'll kick off with some opening reflections from someone who needs absolutely zero introduction, Lord Stern. After that, we have a lot of Peters on this panel, by the way. We'll go to Peter Mannion, who's an associate partner at McKinsey, then to James Close, head of climate at NatWest, then Peter Hill, a former colleague of mine, CEO of COP26, and Peter Cashin, who is the chief investment officer at the IFC, which is within the World Bank. But first of all, over to you, Lord Stern.
Thank you very much, Allegra, and Nick will do fine, and particularly since it's not Peter. I want to do a big macro story. Why does it? It does work. So you've got to keep close. I want to do a big macro story, which is what does climate finance to deliver on Paris look like? And that's particularly we want to examine it from the point of view of emerging markets and developing economies, not counting China, because China doesn't need any external climate finance. I'll be very quick on that because the report is published. You can get the press release and the report itself on the website of the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. But then I'll dive down into the more micro story, particularly on SMEs in developing countries. And I've spent much of my life working with small enterprises in East Africa, India, particularly India, and so on. So the big picture on climate finance is that there's a tremendous growth story there captured. Cities where you can move and breathe, ecosystems which are robust and fruitful, much more efficient use of all our resources, including energy. That's productivity, not killing people on a vast scale from air pollution, not maiming them on a large scale from air pollution. This is a story of investment, innovation in a different way from the past, and it's much more attractive and it's much stronger growth and development. Because it's attractive doesn't mean it's easy. You got to invest a lot to get there. So the report that Vera Songway and I together at the request of the two COP presidencies was describing the investments that you need in order to get implementation of Paris. And as I say, I won't go into a great deal of detail, but under the broad headings of the energy transition, adaptation, resilience, and natural capital. And we look at the necessary investments in those areas, emerging markets, developing economies outside China. We look at it over time, but if you take 2030, that comes to investment flows of $2.4 trillion a year that need to be financed. More than half of that in the energy transition, but significant amounts, perhaps $1 trillion a year, in the three things of adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, and natural capital. And you're going to need very different forms of finance for those different elements. Some will need grant finance. Some of them you'll need finance for big firms engaged in major investments in solar. In other cases, you're going to need more microfinance for decentralized solar and so on. So a very big range of finance necessary, quite a lot of that to SMEs. And we recommend that, well, it's going to be the case that the majority is private sector if we're going to get numbers, but you're going to need a tripling of the MDB financing flows over the next 5 years, with an orientation to the private sector, including the SMEs, for that to happen. And we're fortunate we've got Peter IFC on the platform who'll help us with that. So that's the broad context. Let me now dive into the SMEs, and I'm sure others pick up. But in the richer countries, SMEs are responsible for at least half of output, and it's not an exact thing, but correspondingly a majority of emissions. So if your investments are ignoring the SMEs, they're ignoring at least half of the problem in the rich countries. And that's one reason why Natwest has focused so strongly on that. For transparency, I'm an advisor to Natwest on climate, an independent advisor to Natwest on climate. But if you want to be a green bank, and you should want to be a green bank, what you're doing if you don't, you want to be a dirty bank, that's not a good idea. Bad reputation is bad business, and it's immoral anyway. So actually, it's the immoral argument's the first one. The second one also counts. Then you've got to engage with SMEs, and how you do that, I'm not going to describe that because we've got James on the platform, and he'll do that. Also, we have to think of SMEs not only in terms of their share in the economy, but at least in more advanced countries, as a share in innovation. They have a big role in innovation. Again, I'm sure that will be picked up, should be picked up on the platform. SMEs often have a big role in innovation in poorer countries as well. If you follow the advertisements for husbands and brides in the Indian newspapers or the social media, something I've done for quite considerable time, it used to be that you'd want to marry an IAS officer, Indian Administrative Service, top rank in terms of marriageability. Now people look for startups. Has that person got a startup? So when we talk innovation, we should think it's all over the place. The farmers of Nalanda district in Bihar, a very important district for producing rice, we found by transplanting in different ways and adopting a system of root intensification for rice, they could get much bigger yields. So the innovation, and of course if you don't flood the paddy field, you get less emissions from the methane off the paddy field. So if emissions are coming from a lot of places, you've got to have innovation in a lot of places. And we should think of innovation coming from SMEs in smaller firms in poorer countries as well. But there is a big part of the story where, most of the output comes from SMEs in developing countries, in the informal sector. If you measure SMEs in the formal sector in developing countries, it'll be quite a low number relative to the richer countries. But if you look at the informal sector, and informal is normal, it's mostly informal. The small family farm is informal. The people who fix your tractor are informal. The people who make the bricks are informal, just sticking mud out in the sun. This is a story then of the bigger part of activity being in the informal sector, and how do you reach them? Now, actually you find that you can, and how that actually works is very important, and how it can be increased and tilted greener is very important. Again, I'm a bit over-influenced by India because I've lived and worked there for so long, but it's a pretty big example, and there are plenty of other countries with similar features. But if you want to drill, most of irrigation in India is lifting groundwater. If you want to drill a 10 centimetre bore and put a diesel pumping set on top of it, your first port of call is the local agricultural bank, yeah? And they'll look after you. Mostly they'll look after you because you've got the collateral in the land, so they feel able to lend to you. But of course, if it's a diesel pumping set, it's dirty and polluting in many senses of the word. So the question then becomes, how can you tilt the activities of those banks in a direction which is much cleaner? I believe that the reputational part of the story is very important. The Reserve Bank of India is now encouraging the local banks to prioritize green lending. 10 years ago, they said all this green stuff is slowing down development. We've changed now, happily, and that story of growth is now much better understood, and correspondingly, the RBI has changed. So you can change some regulation, you can demand performance indicators from banks according to what kind of lending they do. Decentralized solar, for example, is tremendously attractive in many ways, and you can keep your shop open at night if you've got decentralized solar and keep the lights on. You know, you can the kids can do studying at home, and this is often because women have less freedom to go out in an Indian village. They can stay at home, look after the solar panel, and charge other people's mobile elsewhere. Huge lots of opportunities. So one part of the story is that the banking systems, the the financial institutions oriented to smaller people can make big progress in this direction. It comes either through regulation or reputation on the whole, and the regulators can make a difference, but the reputational side is enormously important. If there's social pressure, it can translate into business. Lots of examples in things like the Self-Employed Women's Association started in Gujarat, doing their lending mostly to women. Women generally pay back much better than men. I mean, the data on that is pretty good. There's the BRAC in Bangladesh, lots of small savings schemes in Africa and so on. So the potential for those institutions serving smaller people, particularly, of course, in a digital age, is enormous. If we think of SMEs, we will think of this very broad range of activities, as well as seeing how it picks in the future of delivering on Paris at a global level. Thank you.
I liked what Nick did there. He called you Peter IFC, so you are now Peter McKinsey, okay?
Super good. So probably zooming in a little bit on the UK from Lord Stern's global perspective. Is that functioning? Does that work? How about that? It's more complicated than it looks, I promise. Well, on that auspicious start, so probably going to zoom in a little bit on the UK from Lord Stern's global view. And as was said at the outset, I, along with some colleagues, have been working with James and others at NatWest to understand the role that SMEs play in delivering the UK's climate ambition. And maybe the first question to answer is, why are we interested in that question? And I think the answer for us is relatively simple, in that there's no credible path to achieving the UK's Committee on Climate Change roadmaps without substantially mobilizing SMEs. And I think as you step back from that, I think the intuition on it is relatively simple. You know, the success that the UK has achieved in the last couple of decades in terms of decarbonisation has been largely concentrated in sectors like power and in industry, where there are a relatively small number of actors. But as we look ahead to the decade to come, so much of the impact that is assumed in those types of pathways comes from things where SMEs will have a unique role to play. We think of things like home retrofitting, we think of things like heat pump installation, building out an electric vehicle charging network, encouraging a modal shift in our cities. Many of these are inherently about, small-scale construction activities, small-scale interventions, where SMEs typically have a much larger role to play. And when we do the numbers on that, we think about half of the emissions reductions in the decade ahead in a UK CCC pathway can be attributed to SMEs, either through their own kind of direct decarbonisation or through those range of things that SMEs will be essential in delivering. And I suppose the exciting part of that is that this is a significant opportunity for SMEs. It's an opportunity in a number of different ways. One is simply the revenue and growth opportunity. We see that at somewhere around 175 billion pounds of annual revenue if the CCC pathways were to be delivered and SMEs were to play their role in doing so. It's also a significant opportunity for balanced regional development. As we look at those numbers, there is obviously significant scale-up required in every part of the UK, but perhaps encouraging as we think about regional and balanced development, there's a faster amount of scale-up required in areas in the north of England, in Scotland and in Wales. So whatever the term is, it does feed into the levelling up agenda. And then, of course, there's also some pure competitive benefits. We see about 75% of all of the direct investments that SMEs might want to make now come with a standalone business case. And that's up from about 2/3 when we looked at this analysis 12 months ago, given what has happened to energy prices in the interim. So, a significant SME opportunity for those three reasons. But, though there's an opportunity, I think there's also a very substantial challenge here. The reality that James will touch on is that, SMEs today are not primed to capture this opportunity. There are issues around, knowledge and awareness of the opportunity, around access to the right skills and labour, and of course the financing question. So that's a little bit of the kind of cliff notes of the work that we've done, and included in some of the reports on your seat as well. But maybe I'll hand to you, James, to talk about your...
Thank you very much, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here with a functioning mic. So, I think I'd pick up on this opportunity point, and I think, Nick, it's you who always remind us that climate change is the opportunity of the 21st century, the inclusive opportunity of the 21st century. And I think that what this report sets out to do is point SMEs into the direction of those opportunities, both in the UK and also internationally. And I think, in the report, there's a scaling of where those opportunities lie, particularly around the retrofitting energy efficiency measures, but also in many of the new activities that are going to be scaling up as we go through the transition, which includes the rollout of infrastructure for electric vehicles, the initiation of hydrogen and the hydrogen economy, the way in which we're going to have to think differently about food and agricultural systems to make sure that we're capturing carbon in soil rather than depleting our natural capital. And we see our role as a bank, and this is our imploring to other banks, is to recognise and support SMEs in realising those opportunities. And in particular, we're working around setting out the pathways that are going to have to change both here and in the UK and internationally. And I think the other thing that we're trying to do here is just put the context of the UK opportunity into the global opportunity as well. The scale of investment in the UK is, I think, about £1 trillion, 350 billion, according to the report. In the EU, it's nearly 1.5 billion, and globally, it's about 10 billion. So if UK businesses can get themselves geared up for exporting into this new opportunity, then they can become the winners in the 21st century. The second thing I think is really important is access to funding. Now, we've created a funding model which really enables capital to flow to those that can demonstrate that they have security and a track record of performance that gives us confidence that they'll be able to repay their debts. And I think the challenge for SMEs is many of them don't have that track record, and a lot of them in a dematerializing world aren't actually linked to the security of assets. So we need to, as a bank, to think differently about how we assess credit for SMEs and how we think about their business model and the way in which we reward the business models of the future. And we want to provide funding that enables to do that. So we have a target of £100 billion that we set last year at Glasgow between now and 2025 for climate sustainable funding and financing. And we're on track to deliver that, and much of it is going to the SME market. through a variety of measures, including green loans and other forms of concessionality that enables people to use their proceeds for investing in renewables and energy efficiency. The third area that we think is particularly important for SMEs is to know where they stand today. And by that we mean, how do you measure the current position, particularly in relation to carbon. Now, many of the big organizations have huge departments that are able to do carbon measurement and carbon tracking, and it's phenomenally complicated, as we all know, whereas SMEs don't. So we want to make that simple for SMEs, put in their hands carbon tracking tools, and an example of that is Carbon Planner, which we launched last month, and that's available not just for our customers but for all customers, and that's going to be one of the things that I think will improve over time as we get better quality data and we're able to give pass those insights on to our customers. And then the final area, I think, is what we call navigation, which is how do we help SMEs navigate their way through this. And we do that in a number of ways. One is setting up of accelerators, so SMEs can look at where they're going to scale up and how they're going to get access not just to the debt finance but also to the equity finance, but also how they can get access to business experts. And we've done a lot of work with our relationship managers to equip them for conversations around climate change and around energy efficiency. And we've done that in conjunction with the University of Edinburgh, and that's a 3-year partnership that we have ongoing. So we think all those are great lessons for other providers of finance to pick up on and learn from. And we really hope this report goes to stimulate the support that SMEs need, both in the UK and also internationally, and go on to realise that that opportunity that sits out there around financing the transition to net zero. So I'll hand over to you, Peter.
Is that okay? I'll carry on if you can hear me. Can you hear me? I'll carry on. I thought I would reflect a bit on the experience of the last 3 years in sort of managing the COP process, in what it sort of told me about the transition and how that relates to business and SMEs in particular. So the first thing that has struck me, I guess, over 3 years is that the transition is now inevitable. I don't think there's any way it's not going to happen. Now, even 5 years ago, one could have wondered about the politics in some countries as whether that was going to call that into question. I don't myself think that is a question anymore. I think that debate is basically over, and we are going to transition to a net zero economy. And the reason for that, I think, is twofold. The first is impacts, and the second is costs. And one has gone up and the other has gone down. And those are the two fundamental drivers of this process, and I don't see those changing in a way that calls it into question. I think they're only going in one direction. They're going to accelerate action, not slow it down. So if the question about the destination is no longer live, I mean, you'll hear lots of noise, right? Let's not pretend political systems are quiet things. You'll hear lots of noise in lots of countries over the years of the transition. There'll be bumps, we all know that, but fundamentally I don't think the destination in question. The pace, however, really is in question, and that's what all of this is about. So that's what COPs now are largely about. That's what the process is largely about, is what's the pace of this thing. And as we've talked about, there's many elements of that, but the overriding one is finance. And Nick has spoken very eloquently about what needs to be done to mobilise finance at the scale that needs to happen to make a difference. On the private sector side, I think it's clear that as politics drives public policy, so it will drive what will start off as guidance and will become regulation, and that will happen in all jurisdictions. And this has now become what I would call competitive, collaborative endeavour. So I, careful where I admit this, but I worked in the European Commission many years ago. when we were coming up with some of the European targets for emission reductions. And at that time, we were framing them in terms of, we will do X. And if other countries also do their bit, we will do X plus 5 or X plus 10. So there was a slightly sort of negative game theory approach. That's not the debate now. The debate is not only what can I do, but what are others doing? And if you look at the debate, I think in the United States, in the European Union, in China, in India, it's really about who's going to get at the front of this transition rather than be at the back of it. Because people know where this is going, and they don't want to be behind it. They want to be in front of it, and that will ripple through public policy. I'm absolutely sure. I think it's fair to say that SMEs have not been at the front of policymakers' minds across the world as they've thought about this, and there is a risk that for SMEs this comes across as a bit of a what you might call a compliance issue. So let's think about Scope 3. I mean, Scope 3 is going to be the big issue over the coming years about how you not only decarbonize your own operations, but how you decarbonize others. So supply chains, the decarbonization of supply chains is going to be front and center of every major business, and that means SMEs. And so they're going to have to be supported. Take public procurement. I'm absolutely certain that progressively most governments, if they're not already, they will green their public procurement. And when you know how much government takes in terms of its allocation of capital in the economy, that's a major driver of change. So public procurement in most countries in the coming years will be increasingly defined by that. And if you're going to want to win contracts, you're going to have to be part of that. I think the risk is that that's seen as a sort of compliance issue. And it's not really. It really is an opportunity issue. And I think the challenge for all of us, and studies like this can help, and public policy and associations need to help, is to show how this is an opportunity, not a compliance issue. The last thing I wanted to say was just to pick up on Nick's point about SMEs in the developing world, which maybe Peter IFC will pick up on. It is, I think we undervalue and underestimate. I mean, we talk about the role of indigenous peoples in land tenure, in land preservation as custodians of the land. I mean, who is closest to what's going on locally in every developing country around the world? Well, it will be the SMEs. So their role in either actively or negatively affecting decarbonisation, land tenure, land use, all those issues, I think, is probably something that we should be giving more attention to. Peter may be about to tell me that this is front and centre of what the IFC does.
Thank you, Peter. I think that's a great segue to the emerging market perspective, which I would like to give. So first, I'll say a couple words about IFC. Explain what we're doing in the area of SME finance, and then climate. So how does climate fit into SME financing, and why is it so important? So first, just a couple words on the IFC, so International Finance Corporation. We're a member of the World Bank Group. We provided $25 billion in financing last year, and 1/3 of that amount is actually climate related, so mitigation or adaptation. And that's grown from the low teens only a few years ago. So there's tremendous growth. SMEs are a critical part of our priorities, one of our strategic pillars alongside climate finance. One of the reasons that SMEs are so important, I'll share statistics with you. So first, globally, there are over 330 million SMEs. So this makes up 90% of businesses, and they account for 50% of employment. So it's a really, a massive figure. Now, in emerging markets, they have an equal importance. They represent 40% of GDP, and they account for 7 in 10 jobs. So in emerging markets, I think it's even a higher percentage, and those are formal SMEs. So to Lord Stern's point, if you count the informal sector, of course, the number is going to be significantly greater. And between now and 2030, in emerging markets, we need to create 600 million jobs to absorb the workforce, people that are entering the workforce. So SMEs are really the key avenue and way to do that. The challenge, as you might guess, is access to finance. And this is where institutions like IFC and other development finance institutions come in. So half of the formal SMEs do not have access to finance. And that represents, and that's for 65 million SMEs in emerging markets do not have access. And this is a figure of 5.2 trillion a year. So as soon as you start talking the T's, the trillions, it's a massive figure. And if you think it's challenging for male-owned SMEs to get financing, it's actually even harder for women entrepreneurs, women-owned SMEs. So that's been a particular focus for us at the IFC. And the way we come at this obstacle of giving access to finance to SMEs is really twofold. The first is capacity building. So giving the banks, the financial institutions that we work with, the technical skills to be able to lend to SMEs in a profitable way. We also work with banking association, trade associations to improve regulations, remove red tape, to facilitate the financing. And of course, the most important part, we have the money. And not only our own money, but it's key that we mobilize. So basically half of the money that IFC invests, 50% is from our own account and 50% we mobilize from others. As of last fiscal year, we had a portfolio of 12 billion of SME loans in our book, and that represented 43% of our outstanding volume within the financial institutions group. So again, a really significant number. And over the years, we've provided 3 billion in funding directly to women entrepreneurs. And this is a great example of how we use blended finance from the Goldman Sachs Foundation to be able to provide, to scale up in a significant way, funding for women entrepreneurs, plus providing technical assistance. So this panel discussion is really also on climate. And as of last year, the World Bank Board made a commitment to do 1/3, well actually 35% of our funding going forward needs to be climate related. In addition, all of our funding needs to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, which I'm living through right now. It is not easy and very challenging, but it's something we must do and we must get there. So SMEs, since they are such a core part of our funding and climate is such a key piece of our business, there's a natural intersection between the two. And what's really interesting is if we look back to the early 2000s, to where climate finance started at IFC, it's actually with SMEs in Eastern Europe doing energy efficiency. So this was kind of the genesis way back when. And then, eventually renewables came along and electric vehicles and all those good things. But really the genesis for us was SMEs. And that's continued to this day because of all the climate finance legs that we have, SMEs basically is a component. Solar is rooftop solar. So corporate and industrial is a really important segment of the rooftop solar market. Of course, energy efficiency, as I mentioned. Green buildings. Green buildings, all SMEs have facilities. They're very cost conscious. So green buildings is a key part of that. And lastly, I'll talk about climate smart agri. So particularly in developing countries, agribusiness is smallholder farming done by SMEs. So we have a very active climate smart agri program that seeks to improve efficiency and also reduce emissions and increase productivity and use climate-friendly fertilizers as an example. So, for us, SMEs front and center, climate has to be part of the equation and scale is needed, not only from DFIs, but from the commercial private sector. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to open up to questions in a second, but first of all, I just want to ask you a technical question, James, because you've said it to me before, but this is twice now, but you've not unpacked it. How do you assess creditworthiness in a dematerialized world? You keep saying it, and it's quite Madonna as well.
I'm not a banker. I just ask the questions. So we're going to get our credit teams on to working that out. And I think the part of the answer is you look at business models and you look at the business models that are going to work towards emissions reduction and also reduced consumption. So sharing models, rental models, reuse type models, and I think we'll start to get much more data on those as those models emerge. Some coming out of our accelerators, other accelerators, and we'll work out what the indicators are then around how we can lend to them. Some of that will be number of users, amount of subscriptions. So we'll think about some of these things in a different way. Does that answer your question, Allegra?
Okay, who else has got questions in the audience? Okay, great.
Yeah, can I go first? Hello, thank you very much for the interesting panel, the discussion so far. So I'm intrigued. So, my name is Noha Shakir. I'm actually here with the Global Climate Action Team, part of the technical discussions on the implementation of the Paris Agreement, focusing on technology, capacity building, and of course finance and access to finance. SMEs, like you've all I've mentioned and highlighted, play a really important role in the transition to green. Two questions in there. Have you done any assessment of the transition risks that you are actually subject to? That's one thing. Another question for IFC, that's a very courageous decision to take. I can imagine how hard the implementation is going to be on the ground, but that would also require a review of the deployment vehicles that you actually have on the ground, working with banks as the main deployment partner is not necessarily the best setup. When we're looking at emerging technologies and especially climate tech, green tech, entrepreneurs, early stage startups, would you consider deployment of other vehicles that may be suitable for that, like money and funds and the like? And how do you approach the blended finance and as an enabler to catalyze and mobilize private sector funding, as you've mentioned? Thank you very much.
Okay, Peter, IFC, you first, and then...
Thank you, thank you. Yes, so it's a very good point. You can't just rely on traditional banks to provide this funding. This is why we really work extensively with microfinance institutions, non-bank financial institutions, whoever is serving the SME and the underserved. Because really, at the end of the day, it's all about access to finance. And the other key area here that we've developed or is developed in our markets is digital finance and fintechs. So that has become a key avenue for providing financing to SMEs going beyond the traditional banking sector. And we haven't succeeded at scale yet, but we would love to do fintech and climate. And that's underway and we're working on it. So in terms of your point on blended finance, so the panel I was on immediately before this was on blended finance and mobilization. So it's a very hot topic. Over the last 5 years, IFC has raised and deployed 500 million in blended finance, where it would come in and take a first loss piece, enhance some returns, provide advisory services. And we are in the market to raise over $1 billion in additional blended finance now, because the needs are that enormous and that vast. What we really like to do is step into the capital markets in using blended as a blended solution. So we worked with HSBC, the Mundi, to create these global funds to promote green bonds and other types of climate-related.
Who else wants to answer, I think, the lady's first question?
And just to build on the blended finance point, I mean, it's not just for emerging markets. I mean, we need, we work with the British Business Bank, and that provides some concessionality in its finance that we can lend alongside. But on the point of transition risk, I think that's really interesting, because we look at it at a sector level, and then what we call the tall trees, the big businesses that have particular transition risk, whether it's a stranded assets or one around resilience to the climate change that's already embedded in. So I think that there's a really good data point that we have in the tracking work that we do with SMEs around how they feel about the future. And, you know, of course, at the moment, many of them are very nervous that they may not be in business over a long period of time. But that's not necessarily transition risk. That's the sort of short-term economic risk. So we haven't yet teased that out. But I think what's also encouraging here is that 54% of SMEs are giving training to their staff on energy efficiency. And that's the ones who are going to be more resilient in the face of increasing energy and fuel prices.
This gentleman at the back, if you could you perhaps direct a question to Peter Hill or Peter Mannion? This is my pleasure, Peter Hill.
Thanks very much. Hello, Ian Buller from UK Finance. I wanted to bring together a couple of the threads of the day, one of which is net zero transition plans. There was an event this morning on net zero transition plans in this pavilion. I think there's another one happening elsewhere in the German pavilion today. That's one theme. Another is this COP is obviously an Africa COP. I wondered if you could say a bit about what you think the role of net zero transition plans, particularly in the global north, is in delivering finance for emerging markets and developing economies. Thank you.
So I think the question is, what's the role of the transition plans in the global north? And then I didn't get the bit about. And then what's their role in delivering finance to the global south? So there's in all these there's a greening finance and there's a financing green element, and transition plans need to do that. There's the one that you're probably referring to, I think, which was championed by Her Majesty's Treasury. Is that the one that was launched this morning? Yes. And other brands are available. I should just make clear that's not the only transition plan. And clearly, what you don't want is to have transition plans which make it harder to finance in the developing world in order to green your portfolio. That is absolutely the risk you've got to avoid. And I think the key to that is building these country platforms where you can bring together public, private, maybe philanthropy and country plans, because I think those are probably the way you're going to get the private sector involved in emerging markets, which if we do nothing, we probably know what's going to happen. We're going to carry on doing what we've been doing, or worse, which is not enough investment flowing or investment flowing backwards. So I think we've got to bring them to the table, more involved, more support from public finance, and a demand and an ask of the private sector that they don't sit back and say, give us the conditions and we will invest. That's never going to get the money flowing. They've got to be part of the debate, not just bringing capital, but bringing knowledge and expertise. And the only way we're finding of doing that is bringing everyone around the same table behind a plan which is led by the country to crack these problems at first base.
Yeah, I think, and even in the context, going back to the report of the UK, I think one of the things that transition plan in the UK has done is brought great clarity around what that opportunity might be for SMEs, and I think they are a little bit the kind of crystallizing of what the scale-up opportunity could look like. It's easy for an SME now to see kind of what the level of retrofit should be according to a transition plan, or a heat pump installation, or a VV installation. And I think providing that clarity to the SMEs and then to those who will finance them, can help them grasp the opportunity and provide that longer term planning horizon than what you would have without such plans.
This is for the streaming. Starting with Nick, what's the in one sentence? What's the policy that would help SMEs in the transition?
From the point of view of financing institutions, it's financial institutions that can bring both knowledge and accessible finance, and the name of the game is to put the two together in a way that people can understand and get their arms and heads round?
I think it might link to supportive procurement. I think there's a risk that if the both state and corporate procurement starts demanding substantial emissions reductions across its supply chain, that can be damaging to SMEs. But if it's done in a more supportive way, it can be a big enabler.
And I'd say support around innovation, creating the conditions for innovation from a policy perspective, and also through the institutions that can exist to enable that to happen.
We'll have the full house by the end. I would say it's the support in greening the supply chain. So it's big companies who've got to manage their scope 3, supporting their suppliers in greening, because it'd be quite hard for a number of these smaller companies to do it on their own with no support and no information.
I'll echo a bit, but the funding gap, so filling that with funding. Second, advisory services to provide the expertise on climate, on transitioning and what that would mean. And lastly, to do it with scale and leverage fintech in that process, because that it can be the most efficient delivery mechanism for funding to SMEs.
Excellent. Well, can you put your hands together for our panel today? Lord Stern, Peter Mannion, James Close, Peter Hill, and Peter Cushing.